Hi, everyone. My name is Akshat Rathi, and I'm a reporter with Bloomberg Green. This segment, we're going to talk about batteries. It doesn't feel like any day goes by without hearing about an automaker announcing plans to launch new electric models or to pivot their company towards electrification. The technology that is enabling that transformation is lithium ion batteries. And very few people, even Tesla superfans, rarely realize what is happening inside the battery. But what happens inside is becoming now a multi-billion dollar industry. And with us today, we have Jagdeep Singh, who is the CEO of QuantumScape, one of the hottest battery startups that last year publicly listed and is valued at something like between 10 and 20 billion dollars over the past few months. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Jagdeep and his colleagues for a feature story that appeared in this most recent issue of Bloomberg Green magazine. And I'm hoping that in today's conversation, we'll be able to give you a flavor of not just what QuantumScape is doing and where it is in the battery race, but also about batteries in general and how important they are going to be to the energy transition. Hi, Jagdeep.
Hey, Akshat, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So, QuantumScape is doing something that battery researchers have been wanting to achieve for essentially as long as lithium-ion batteries have existed. The first lithium-ion battery was built, as very few people probably know, in ExxonMobil. And they used, as one of their ingredients in the battery, lithium metal. Now, tell us why you have built a battery that sort of harks back to its history and yet takes a leap forward.
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're right to recognize that innovation by Stan Whittingham in the Exxon days. So, the first batteries that involved lithium ions moving back and forth did in fact use a lithium metal anode, so an anode made of pure metallic lithium. And the reason to do that is fairly simple. The lithium metal is the highest energy density anode you could have if the ion that's being transported is in fact the lithium ion. Now, the problem Stan found is that those batteries were not stable. Lithium metal does not work well with today's liquid electrolytes. It reacts, and that results in a couple of problems. One is you have impedance growth or resistance growth inside the cell as the reaction byproducts basically block the path of ions inside the cell. And the second, more fundamental problem is that you have the growth of these needle-like crystals called dendrites that grow from the lithium anode, can penetrate through the separator that keeps the anode and cathode apart and result in a short circuit, which is obviously catastrophic because you have a fire. So to solve these problems, the advances that were made in the lithium-ion industry were to replace that anode of pure metallic lithium with an anode made of carbon. And the idea was with the carbon anode, instead of lithium ions finding each other and creating a metallic bond, so it becomes pure lithium metal, those ions are held in that ionic state between the carbon atoms. So you have 6 carbon atoms that hold 1 lithium atom. It worked very effectively at preventing dendrites. Unfortunately, it came at the expense of a lot more volume being taken up by the anode and a lot more mass being taken by the anode. And also, it slowed down the rate at which you could charge these cells because those lithium ions had to diffuse into the solid carbon particles, which took a finite amount of time. So the approach worked. It allowed the industry to make cells that were relatively safe, and then pretty much that architecture of using carbon on the anode, a mixed metal oxide cathode material, and a polymer separator flooded with a liquid electrolyte has been the architecture that has been there for now 30 years. So no fundamental change has happened there other than small improvements to which metals you're using in the cathode and so on. So when we wanted to deliver a disruptive increase in energy density in batteries, the obvious place to look was to go back to that lithium metal anode and recapture the energy density benefits of pure metallic lithium, as well as the power density benefits of not needing that to have that diffusion bottleneck. Of course, that then required solving this electrolyte interaction problem, and in particular, it required building a solid state electrolyte that did not react with the lithium metal. That's what we spent 10 years working on. We were very fortunate that our team was able to find a material like that. We published a number of results back in December that showed the performance of that material, which was quite remarkable in terms of the rate of power it could run at, the temperature it could run at, the cycle life that it was able to get without forming those dangerous lithium metal dendrites. And then now that we have that material, the task ahead is to take this into production and commercialization, which is a lot of work, but we think it's less fundamental than the physics and chemistry associated with finding that material.
Right. So just so we have a context for the timeline here, the lithium metal battery that was invented in Exxon came around 1970-ish. The first commercial lithium-ion battery, which replaced the lithium metal with carbon, which was a safer option, came around 1990. And since then, essentially, we've had for the past 30 years, small tweaks to the same chemistry that existed in 1990. But that has enabled us to go from being able to use lithium-ion batteries in just consumer electronics to being able to power electric cars and maybe soon electric planes. Now, in your own personal timeline, correct me if I'm wrong, but until about early 2000s, you weren't really thinking about batteries. What made you pivot and think about batteries?
Yeah, so I wasn't, you're right, I was running the company in the telecom equipment field, which we had taken public, and I was the CEO of that company. I had just purchased the Tesla Roadster. Tesla just introduced its Roadster in 2008. So I was driving this car to work every day. In driving that car every day, you couldn't help but think about two contradictory things. In one sense, that it was you could argue that was the future of cars because it was really fast and it was really clean and fun to drive. On the other hand, it had a lot of limitations, and all those limitations stem from the battery. So I started thinking more and more about the battery problem, and to be candid, got somewhat obsessed with trying to solve the battery problem. I became convinced that the battery problem may be the biggest unsolved problem in all of technology, because coming from the world of technology, I had seen how computing power had been growing at an exponential rate, and memory storage and disk storage all had been growing very rapidly. But batteries and energy storage had been growing at a very, very slow rate, about 3, 4, 5% per year. So it takes about 20 years to double energy density in batteries at that rate. And I got obsessed enough to where I decided to leave my job as CEO of this company, join a venture capital firm as an entrepreneur in residence to work on this problem.
And when you initially started working on the problem, of course, as you said, there were a number of criteria you wanted to meet, which is a battery that is longer lasting, so you could drive further distance in a car, is easier to charge or faster charging so that you don't have to wait for hours at a charging station. And then, of course, safer because lithium-ion batteries are risky equipment if you're not able to handle it well or because of the ingredients in it. But when you started off, you weren't looking at this lithium metal battery. It was a completely different idea, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, the 5 key problems we wanted to solve were: can we make a battery that has more energy density, about double the energy density, so we can get more range on a single charge, faster charge, so as you said, we can charge in a time that's more comparable to what we were used to with combustion-based gasoline-powered cars. That's safer, that is has longer life, and ideally is lower cost. The initial approach that we decided to pursue, and while I was an entrepreneur in residence at this venture capital firm, I ended up meeting up with a professor and his postdoc from Stanford. They had been working on some independent ideas. We decided to combine forces and do one company. That idea was a pretty radical idea. It was known as the all-electron battery. And it was basically a supercapacitor that was leveraging quantum dots to try and make a very high permittivity dielectric that could be used to create a very high energy storage capability supercapacitor. that was how we spun the company out, was to pursue that technology. We quickly concluded, however, that technology was going to take more work than we thought to commercialize. And what we realized was that we would be able to solve or address the same targets we had in terms of those requirements I laid out: energy density and power density and safety and so on, by using a solid state separator coupled with a lithium metal anode in a conventional battery type electrochemical energy storage system. So we pivoted, if you will. Pivots are never are never painless. In Silicon Valley, it's you run the risk of picking a new direction that is at odds with the DNA of the team that you built, and you may have investors that have a certain set of expectations and customers and so on. We were lucky in a couple of ways. One is that the overall value proposition we were selling did not need to change at all. So the investors that bought into this notion of solving the energy storage problem didn't need to change what problem they thought they were backing in backing us. And the core team that we had, which is a team of chemists and physicists, was also equally applicable to this new problem. So we luckily were able to make that pivot. And when we started in that new direction, we still didn't know if we could find a material that could serve as this solid state separator. And it took, to be candid, it took kind of an Edisonian process where we had to just sort through and sift through many different types of materials to find one that worked. That process started out with computational modeling, where you can have very a large funnel, if you will, and then as you narrow down the candidates computationally, you then have to still synthesize a lot of materials in the lab, and after you synthesize those, you test them, and then finally, if you're lucky, you end up with a material that can do the job. We ended up with two materials that were candidates to do the job, and of those two, really one of them we thought really had the ability to resist dendrites to the level required to be a useful solution for cars, and that's the one that we ended up using.
And of course, pivots are not something that any startup enjoys, but aren't unusual in Silicon Valley. But pivots, when they typically happen in Silicon Valley, are with software companies, which don't have, the pivot is not as radical a change for the company. Now, you had to make that radical change, and you had to do it in a sort of a setting that requires hard technology challenges. What do you think played into the success of getting to that material? What was it in that period from the pivot to finding that material were the key ingredients for making that happen? And I think this is sort of a lesson for other people who want to ever consider getting into the battery space.
Yeah, so the pivot fortunately was made pretty early on. I think within 6 to 12 months of officially launching the company, we concluded that this was going to be the original idea was going to be a longer term project that we had realized at the beginning, and so we were able to do it before we had spent a lot of capital and gone too far down that path. But as I mentioned, the thing that allowed us to do this was that even though it was a pivot from a technology standpoint, we ended up using an electrochemical approach instead of an electrostatic approach, where supercapacitors store energy based on electrostatics and batteries store energy based on electrochemical behavior. The problem we were solving, the requirements of the energy storage solution, and the underlying DNA of the people that we needed was not that different, and that's what allowed us to do this. So again, we didn't need to tell our investors that there's a whole another application we have to focus the company on, or change the requirements that we were solving. That was the biggest thing for me, is we were really able to go after the same target performance specs with the electrochemical approach using the solid state separator and lithium metal anode that we were targeting with the supercapacitor. And then the fact that the core team, our CTO Tim Holm, whom you met, really one of the most brilliant guys I've ever met in my career, has a background in both material science and physics. He was seamlessly able to transition over to that new approach.
Right. And now you've, of course, listed through this form, which has become quite popular on Wall Street through a special acquisition corporation, and that is something that earlier stage companies are able to do now, but with that comes risk, especially in an industry that is very tied to secrecy. A lot of the data, both not just from your company, but most other battery startups, is company self reports that data, and you as an expert or as an outside investor have to find your own expertise to be able to judge whether to invest in a company or not. What are the challenges of dealing with this sort of world where you've come to the public listing scrutiny stage earlier than most technology companies would do, and in a space where there is so much secrecy?
Yeah, the reason for the secrecy is because it takes a lot of time and energy to work on these new materials, and if you have invested that much time and energy and you found a material that works, you want to try to produce a fair return for the investors that took the risk on that material, as well as deliver value to your customers uh, before the material gets commoditized. So you don't want to make it easy for players that haven't done the work to basically rip off the work that you've done. Um, uh, Now, I don't have a problem with secrecy. I think companies are entitled to be secret about what they do. However, what I have a problem with is if you're going to be secret, then you shouldn't make claims, right? If you're going to make claims about your performance, you have to show the data that supports those claims. So I would say there's three levels of communication that a company could have. Um, the first level of information is claims. I have a better battery that can do X, Y, and Z, right? That is not enough. You have to then say, here's actual testing data under specified conditions that shows that the claims I'm making are in fact real. And you have to be able to say these claims are validated by third parties. Um, uh, the thing you don't have to do is provide details about your material composition, the processes used to make it, and so on. Those are sort of inside the black box. But outside the black box, you should be able to show actual data that demonstrates the performance of your technology. And when I say validated, I mean that not just that you paid a third-party lab to do the testing, but that somebody who actually has skin in the game, has tested this technology and validated it. And so, in our case, there is no higher validation than that you get from actual customers that want to buy your product. So we are very gratified that we've had multiple automotive OEMs test our cells in their labs and see results that are consistent with the results that we've published on our own. Now, you mentioned this notion of self-reporting. I think I want to be clear. I mean, short of people that are actually like outright fabricating results, and I don't know many many players like that, even in the battery industry. Self-reporting is how research is done. When you read a peer-reviewed journal paper, right, whether it's in the battery field or in the pharmaceutical field, those experiments are done by uh, the, the people in a given lab, and they publish the data from those experiments. They don't then give the actual compositions to third parties to replicate before the journal paper is published. What's circulated as part of the peer review process is a paper containing the results, and that's what the peers comment on. Are these results interesting or not? Are they important or not? And so on. And that's what we've done. We've made public our data as far as the cycle life that we see, the current densities or rates of power which we run at, and the temperatures at which we do this testing. Those are pretty important variables because in the battery space, you mentioned as we were talking before we started the interview, this notion of the and problem. The and problem is a really important point in batteries. The reason why batteries are so hard is because you have to meet the cycle life requirement and the operating temperature requirement and the current density requirement and the depth of discharge and the pressure. These are all challenges where if you compromise on one of them, you can show a battery that has some results, but it's not useful. It doesn't do anybody any good to have a battery that only works at 60 or 70, 80 degrees Celsius. It has to also work at lower temperatures. It doesn't do any good to have a battery that only works at very low current densities because you can't drive a car at low current density. So you have to meet these requirements simultaneously. And with solid state, the hardest thing has been to find a material that could meet all those requirements simultaneously. And that's the thing that we were excited about. So in terms of data, what we believe that we have been leading the charge in terms of transparency of this industry. And again, we're not disclosing the composition of the material, but we are disclosing to a very high level of transparency the performance data from testing the cells.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think peer review is something that people are aware of, but of course, there's a difference because in the peer review system, when the journal publishes the paper, they also publish the methods and the exact materials so that you can go out and replicate that data. That, of course, no battery company is going to do because that's proprietary information. That's what your investors have paid for. But there are companies that do third-party validation that is independent, which is not just your customer, but say a national laboratory in the US or somewhere else, which is considered as a reputable third party. That hasn't happened on your end. And is that something you're going to pursue at some point?
I'll be candid with you. I've never understood why that's considered more objective by the observers that keep pointing that out. I mean, it's a paid lab that's testing your cell. To me, a much higher level of validation comes from a customer that actually is putting skin in the game. So you're not paying the customer is paying you, which means they have a much higher bar to be accepted. We'll consider it. If that's all it takes, we'll consider it. But we currently haven't really.
Yeah, I ask because apart from becoming the hottest battery startup and being public, you've also now got the infamy of becoming the first battery startup that's been attacked by a short seller. Now, short sellers are plenty in the world. They come along, but they're able to put out these sort of 100+ page reports because of the secrecy in the industry and because the third-party validation, which is not shown or results are not shared, give them fodder to be able to poke holes. And many of the issues that were raised are issues that we've talked about. Batteries are hard. You have to be able to scale them up. That those numbers have to match what the performance needs to match. But how do you tackle the sorts of attacks that come from places like Scorpion Capital?
If getting a third-party lab to test our cells would get rid of these kinds of random attacks, it'd be something that we consider. Do you really think, Akshat, that if all the data we had shared had in fact been generated by a third-party lab, that anything would have been different about that particular report? Because that report was not interested in the facts, right? I mean, let's be honest here. I mean, first of all, I want to be candid, right? There is a legitimate short thesis you could have about QuantumScape, right? And that short thesis would be around, well, this is great. It demonstrates some amazing results in terms of the capability of these cells, but they still have yet to scale up the production and the factories and the time that it takes, all that. And those are uncertainties. And so somebody could say, you know what, I believe that's going to be harder than they think. Legitimate point. We don't argue with that because they're entitled to that opinion. The problem is that's not what the short seller was doing. He shorted the stock most likely on a Wednesday. On a Thursday morning before the market opened, he published a report full of lies, misinformation, and innuendo. Later that day, as the stock price dropped, he probably covered his short already. So he was already gone from the market. This had nothing to do with a belief that the company's fundamental risks were fundamental. This is about essentially market manipulation. And that's what I have a problem with. So I'm not sure that a third-party lab, having tested these results, even if all the data in our presentation came from a third-party lab, would have changed that particular scenario. But I'll be honest with you, we don't intend to have our strategy be driven by a random short seller looking to profit on the markets. However, the questions you're bringing up for people like you who are legitimate observers of the industry, if it makes you feel more confident in the data, then it's something that I think we will in fact consider. And so I'm happy to hear that you think that could be helpful because if we can give data to our customer, give cells to our customers and have them successfully test, then clearly we can give those same cells to a third-party lab and have them test as well. So maybe we should be less stubborn, and maybe we should say, you know what, even though we don't see the value in it, enough people would find it useful to where we'll do it. So with that said, I think we will consider doing that.
And then just a final question, which is that forward-looking now, in say your cells, which still are being worked on to be able to match the performance levels that it needs to get into a car, and you're going to do that, in the coming years. You're building a number of factories for starting a pilot line in California, and then a full-scale gigafactory with Volkswagen at a location that's not been disclosed yet. But till 24, 25, you're not going to see those batteries come in a car. What do you imagine the future of lithium-ion batteries? Not 2025, when you might be able to get into a car, but 2030 and 2035 and 2040.
Well, maybe a couple quick points here. One is that because battery chemistries are so long-term in nature, they don't change very rapidly. Again, as we discussed at the beginning, lithium-ion in its current form has been around for about 30 years with relatively incremental changes over that period of time. It's not impossible that lithium metal with solid state could drive another few decades worth of battery technology with relatively small improvements to what we're doing today. So we think what we're doing is so fundamental that it could easily be the basis for the next 20 years of battery improvements or beyond. The second point I would make is that if we can truly industrialize this technology with the functionality we're talking about, energy density 50-80% better, 15-minute fast charge, longer life, safety, better economics, we should be able to get a really substantial portion of the EV battery market. By 2030, our ambition, and we haven't publicly announced this, so I'll refrain from actually throwing out a number, but our target is a very significant share of the overall EV market. If we're right about what we're doing, that large share should be achievable. And conversely, if it's not achievable, then we shouldn't really maybe the benefits we're talking about are not as compelling. But in our view, the feedback we've gotten from current customers is that's the benefits are in fact very compelling. And so it really just comes down to execution. I can't sit here and guarantee you that we can execute flawlessly, Akshat. That would be arrogant because I haven't seen the future. I don't have a crystal ball. No one does. But what I can say is the team has made amazing progress on really hard problems in the past. The problems we see going forward, in my opinion, are not as hard as the problems we've already solved, because we've solved problems really in fundamental physics and chemistry and thermodynamics. And the problems lying ahead of us have more to do with execution and manufacturing and factories. Those problems have been solved. One last comment I'll make here. I know I'm running out of time, but the solid state separator and dendrite problem took 45 years of research to solve. So that problem we demonstrated in December, we've addressed within the parameters that we show the data on. The problem we have coming up, which is building factories, that problem has already been solved. Tesla built a gigafactory in like a year and a half, I think. So, we know there's no new physics required to build factories and scale factories. What's required is execution skills, capital, customer demand for what you're building, and we think we have all those things. So at this point, I think time shall tell, but we feel quite good about the prospects.
Well, thank you very much for the chat. I hope the audience got a flavor into the inside of the battery, this black box that is going to be so crucial for the energy transition, and not just for EVs, which has been the one topic we've talked about, but many different economic sectors. So thank you, Jagdeep.
Akshat, always a pleasure. Thanks for having us.